There's counterfeit Pine points on the market? Oh my goodness. I'm gonna have to call the FBI. Kai, yes, you're first. Sorry, David. But first shall be last. There's a meetup in Phoenix. What kind of meetup? Norway, welcome. John Skijeseth. John Skijeseth. No, there's no way I'm pronouncing that right. Put it phonetically in the chat. So there's people in the chat. That's why I'm talking to them. Welcome, everyone. I forget the person's name. Oh, one of my subs asked me to critique Dr. Edward Feser. And so that's what I'm going to do today on the 5 proofs of the existence of God. And we might get through one. We'll see. Doug, I just want to say that I enjoy your channel because you remain a gentleman. Well, thank you, Joy. I get very frustrated with people like Dee who are so rude. Yeah, I don't know. I think I can be rude once in a while, and but I try my hardest to be real. And so sometimes part of being real is getting frustrated at times and calling people's arguments stupid. But I honestly think that some theists appreciate that because what you see is what you get, I think. FBI is busy? Okay. But yeah, I got to look into the counterfeit Pine points. But 1,000 Pine points to Kai today. I'll give David, you get 7 because that's the Lord's number of Pine points. Dr. Edward Feser, let me tell you a little about this guy. He's a Roman Catholic. He was born and raised in Roman Catholicism, I believe. But sometime in his life, he became an atheist. He's into philosophy. And he got his PhD in philosophy, I think, around the age of 30 or maybe late 20s. And he taught courses on things like the arguments from God going way back to Aristotle and Aquinas. And he just thought all those arguments were silly. But then he thought, well, I got to keep my classes interesting. And so he would try to steelman those arguments as much as possible. And in the process of steelmanning the arguments they're basically first cause type arguments. They're all related to that. He ended up believing them. And once you know it, he started believing in a God and then believed, that God is the Roman Catholic God. It's one of those things where, you're born and raised in it, you have doubts. He left, dive in deep, and once you know it, the belief system he was raised in happened to be the right one. You see this time and time again. Now, I have a real problem. And my problem is when I do these critiques, not always, but I sometimes look into the history of these people. And maybe I shouldn't do that because I found out the basic timeline. I know he's at 50 years old, I think. I know that he has 6 kids. It's on Wikipedia. And it makes it sound like those 6 kids are still living at home with him. So, if he had 6 kids over the span of 15 years, which I think is reasonable, maybe 20, that puts him around 30 when he had started to have kids, or early 30s maybe. And so that means he got married before then, if he's a good Christian guy. And you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, I hope I'm wrong. In fact, Ed Feser, if you listen to this, please contact me and tell me I'm wrong with what I'm about to say. But I think you met a beautiful, young Roman Catholic gal in your late 20s, early 30s. And this played a part of why you're Roman Catholic today. Not so much Aquinas. I know. Isn't that terrible I just said that? But let's be real. Like, these things happen, and they do play a part in I think belief formation. Before I get into this critique, I want to ask Christians who, they probably already clicked off after my last comment, but I want to ask Christians this question. What would the universe look like if your God did not exist? If any God didn't exist? Now, I'm sure you've heard that question before from guys like me, and questions like, what would the universe look like if it wasn't designed? And I want to propose to you that if your answer is, well, that universe would not exist, or I can't even imagine that, I think we have a huge, huge problem on our hands now. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I don't think you value truth. If you can't even imagine that, if you can't even picture that, if you can't even think about that. Because you know how I often get the response from even guys like James White from a long time ago. He said something like, I just have a presupposition against miracles, that, and that's why I can't see the truth of Christianity. Why can't a guy like me say that certain Christians have a presupposition against even considering that naturalism, as defined as like the only thing that exists is natural? If you can't even entertain that idea for a second, why can't I just say you have a presupposition against naturalism? Like, don't you care about truth? Why is it always, oh, you have a presupposition against miracles, so I'm going to write you off? Would you like it if I wrote you off, Christians, if you are not willing to answer the question, what would a universe without a God look like, or what would an undesigned universe look like? Should I just write you off if you say to me, oh, I can't even entertain that question? And I think the reason why I'm bringing this up, I think this is the core of a lot of these arguments, first cause argument and so forth, that they can't even, some Christians are not even willing to entertain that idea that, well, I'll get into it. Another thing that a lot of these arguments talk about is they use words like contingent and necessary and prime mover and so forth. But if you can't falsify a concept or even begin to imagine how you would go about falsifying it. So, for example, if you say God is a necessary being, what would it look like if he wasn't? How would you know if he wasn't? How would you refute that he wasn't or that he is? Like, how, if you can't even imagine these things, like what good is it? You're just asserting it at that point, right? And it becomes an axiom. And maybe some things we do need axioms for. I think some axioms are fair. I think, like, for example, my axiom is that we don't live in the matrix and that the universe actually exists and has the properties that it has. But if you are going to posit this God as a necessary being, just come out and say, that's just an axiom. I can't show otherwise. But let me bring up, since all this is related to the Kalam, you notice I got this little Rationality Rules logo here. I did that for a reason. Hopefully he doesn't get mad at me that I'm using his slide. I don't think he will, because it's just like 3 sentences. And I want you guys, if you haven't already, watch his channel and what he has to say. And he goes into all the logical fallacies of it and so forth. But in my opinion, a lot of people, they just zone out when they hear the word fallacy, special pleading, argument from ignorance, all those things. They just kind of like, their brain goes fuzzy. So I like to keep things simple. But if you read this, it says, whatever begins to exist has a cause. That seems pretty reasonable, right? Notice it doesn't say everything that begins to exist. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Yeah, it seems like a lot of scientists say that. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That's pretty reasonable, right? Now, if the universe has a cause, and if there's nothing before the universe, then I guess, yeah, it makes total sense that God did it, right? Should I just become a theist now? Right. Am I done? Like, I don't even have to critique Dr. Edward Feser, do I? But if we value this thing called truth, let's really look at the first one. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Can someone give me examples of things that begin to exist? Like, intuitively, I kind of said right away that seems reasonable. But what are some examples of things that exist, that begin to exist? Okay, so I'm just going to pick things off my table here. I have a wallet. Did that begin to exist? Well, yeah, I guess it did, right? A leather manufacturer put it together, and there's probably glue in here, and the company put little pockets in there, and so that wallet began to exist. How about these sticky notes? Like, it's made of paper, so some trees had to give their life for these, and then there's some glue on here, some polymers. But before it was done, like, it didn't exist, but now it does exist. So this began to exist. This magnifying glass, yeah, it has glass, silicon, oxide, plastic, polymer. This began to exist. The materials were put together by someone, and they created this. But you notice what all these things that began to exist have in common? They all started with materials beforehand. So almost anything you can think of that begins to exist had something before it to put it together. The universe began to exist. Okay. If you're a theist, how do you define universe? I think this is a great question to ask theists. What do you mean by universe? And I think a lot of theists say, well, it's everything. It's everything that's could be or has been. It's everything. That's in space, time, matter. It's just everything. But that's not technically the scientific definition of the universe. Did you know that? The universe is basically the beginning of our reality, what we see around us, what we can observe. So when you hear that, 13.6 billion years old, that's the age of the universe, that's actually the age of the beginning of the expansion of the universe after the Big Bang. When the Big Bang, boom, and then you start the clock. That's when time entered. That's when we have atoms. That's when things started moving far apart. That's when suns and planets started to form. So that's the universe, scientifically. Before that, we can't say anything because we don't know what was before the Big Bang. But does that mean that there was nothing before the Big Bang? Or does that mean that there was nothing before the singularity? Does that mean there wasn't other universes or realities? No, it doesn't mean that at all. So I think that is a big misconception that a lot of theists have, that you could almost use our universe, small u, and sort of like, if you want to view everything even before our universe, or maybe there's another universe that resides currently, but that we would put capital U, big universe. So here's the basic problem with this whole argument, and that is that if one's to be consistent, you would say whatever begins to exist has a cause, but intuitively we know that everything that begins to exist comes from materials that are put together. the universe began to exist. So if we want to stay consistent here, we would say, okay, the universe began to exist based on materials, just like these Post-it notes. So the universe began to exist on other materials. Therefore, the universe has a cause from, we don't know, but maybe based on some type of something before it. But this is not what theists like. They don't say this. They say that the universe began from nothing. But really, you can't get that from premise one. Because everything, all the evidence points to what we see in our reality, our intuitions, is that there's always something that's creating something else. But the theists are not saying that. They're saying it comes from nothing. But you can't get that from this alone. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's play this clip from Ed Feser. It's a debate with Arif Ahmed on the Unbelievable podcast. And I'm starting it at around 46, 44. And I actually, when I watched this the first time, I made notes on how long each guy talked. And even though this, I titled this as Critiquing Dr. Edward Feser, and it's a debate situation, Edward Feser does most of the talking here. It's 70% of the time Edward Feser is talking, and it's just bloviation. Arif Ahmed just makes some very pointed comments and asks some very pointed questions. But they're talking about the rationalist proof for God, which has to do with the principle of sufficient reason. There has to be reasons for things. And if there is no God, then there's no reason for the universe, and that's just uncomfortable. I'm straw manning now, right? So let's just play the clip and see what Ed has to say.
Yeah, we've got about another 10 minutes or so on this side of another break to get into the second of the two arguments we're looking at today on the show, Ed. The rationalist proof. Do you want to give us a brief summary of that particular argument, and we'll see what Arif has to say in this one?
Sure. So the rationalist proof is, it has that name because it's famously associated with rationalist philosophers like Leibniz, early modern German philosopher Leibniz, also with the English early modern philosopher Samuel Clarke. And so I defend this proof, though the way I would defend the argument against certain objections would differ in some ways with the way that a Leibniz or a Clarke would defend it, because
Leon asked me, why do you continue to make these videos? You're protesting too much. I'm doing this because I was asked to, and I just want to be loved, Leon.
I'm an Aristotelian and a Thomist, the follower of Aquinas, rather than a rationalist in the strict sense. So, but putting that sort of qualification or complication aside, the basic idea of the rationalist proof is that it starts with what I referred to earlier as the principle of sufficient reason, which tells us that for anything that exists, for any event that occurs, there must be some reason or explanation why it's the way it is rather than some other way. There's some way to make it intelligible. There's some explanation. Now,
there has to be a reason for something to exist compared to some other way. Now, throughout this whole discussion, I want you to picture the nature of this guy's God. Ed Feser believes in the Roman Catholic God. Why does the nature of that God, why is it the way it is and not something else?
Now, we may not always know what the explanation is, but there is objectively, as a matter of fact, whether we can discover it or not, some explanation or way of making intelligible the things that exist in the world around us. And the idea is that this is a principle that we apply in science, in everyday common sense reasoning and explanations, and in philosophy. What the rationalist proof suggests is that if we push through consistently, however, what's entailed by the principle of explanation, we're going to be led unavoidably to the existence of a divine cause of the world. And the basic idea, and you see this famously expressed in Leibniz, is that the things in the world of our experience are contingent. They exist, but they did not have to exist. They could have been otherwise. The desk in front of me exists, but it could have been otherwise. Had the desk manufacturer never come into being, it wouldn't be here. And contingent things, therefore, because they could have been otherwise, we need some explanation of why they're not otherwise, why they exist when they could easily have not existed.
So we need some explanation. That's basically to sum up the first minute or two that he's talked. But again, I want you guys, and if you're a Christian listening to this, keep in mind the nature of your God through all of this. Now, he's using this for the universe. Like, why does the universe exist? Why does anything exist? But apply the same reasoning, not to God's existence, but to God's nature. This is really important. Why is God's nature the way it is instead of some other type of nature? Why is, Ed Feser, why is your God good or loving instead of hateful? Is there a reason why he's loving, why his nature is loving? Or is it just arbitrary? Is there no reason? It just has to be that way.
And even if we appeal to some other contingent thing, like the existence of a desk maker, that just kicks the problem back a stage. And indeed, even if, as Leibniz says, we take this series of contingent things, one contingent thing being caused by another, which is caused by another, all the way back into the past and without any sort of beginning, if we suppose that the world of contingent things has always been here, we still have the question of why there's any world of contingent things at all rather than nothing, or why it's this world of contingent things, even if it's infinitely old, that exists rather than some alternative world of contingent things.
I sometimes wonder if there's a personality type that I need to know why certain things are the way they are, especially on these big questions like the origins of the universe. If there's a personality type that leads you to become a theist, because if you don't have that answer, you have that angst in you, and that people who are more like say, if they're more likely to say, I don't know, maybe someday we'll know, I'm not too anxious about that. And those types of people tend to become more agnostic atheists.
And if we appeal to some higher order contingent reality in order to explain that, then we're just kicking the problem up to yet a higher level. The only place the buck can stop, as it were, then, is with something that's not contingent, but exists in an absolutely necessary way, something that not only exists, but could not possibly not have existed.
Yeah, and why couldn't someone just posit that the universe is not contingent, that it's necessary? It has that one of its properties is to be necessary.
And then when you unpack the idea of what it is to be a necessary being in this way, the argument is that you can pull out of this concept all of the traditional divine attributes, something that's outside of time and space, is immaterial, is omnipotent, omniscient, and the whole ball of wax. But the idea is that nothing less than this...
How do you get that a necessary being has to be omnipotent, omniscient? I don't understand that.
Will fulfill the requirements of the principle of sufficient reason, that things are ultimately intelligible, or there's a way to make sense of them or explain them.
So it's another argument which draws on the idea of having to stop an infinite regress in a sense, but in a different way this time. That it's about this idea of the contingency of everything else that appears to exist, requiring an explanation for its existence. Whereas the only way you can stop that infinite regress is with something that requires no explanation for existence. It has necessary existence in that sense. So yeah, where do you want to begin with this one?
Thanks. One thing that Ed said in his very clear summary of the argument was that science presupposes this principle that everything has an explanation. Now, I think it's true that scientists look for explanations of things, and we too, in ordinary life, look for explanations of things, if that means, for instance, a statement of its efficient cause, or a statement of some reason that some had for bringing it about, or any other such thing that we would normally call an explanation. But the mere practice of looking for explanations doesn't entail that one is always there to be found. Indeed, it seems to me the most plausible thing in the world that there are some things we'll never understand. Nor can I see that any scientific theory that I know of entails that everything has an explanation, unless it has a particular one in mind. So I'm wondering what exactly the evidence is that science doesn't just proceed by looking for explanations, but actually entails that the PSR is true.
Yeah, basically, very... concisely, Arif is saying, why do you think that everything has to have an explanation?
But the PSR being the principle of sufficient reason, that everything must have an explanation.
Right.
Yes, go ahead.
Right. So what I would say is that Yes, I did say that science presupposes it, and philosophy and common sense do as well, insofar as they're all in the business of explanations, and if you're looking for an explanation, that presupposes that there's one there to be found. The question, though, is, well, does this entail that we have to believe that strictly everything has an explanation? And what I would say is it's not any particular finding of science, not any particular theory in physics or chemistry or psychology or any other of the special sciences that show us that the principle of sufficient reason is true. What I would argue instead is that the very practice of looking for explanations in general really makes no sense unless we suppose that that everything does have an explanation, unless we commit ourselves to the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason.
Why can't someone have the idea that I'm trying to figure out how to explain something, and I'm hoping that there's an explanation, but still open to the idea that maybe there isn't, and just move from there? Like, it doesn't have to be a complete blanket that everything has to have an explanation.
And one reason for saying this is that if we deny the principle of sufficient reason, if we deny that everything has an explanation, then we're going to be led into a kind of incoherence. We're going to be led to at least an implicit conflict with our practice of looking for explanations. So, for example, we normally take it to be the case that the reason why we arrive at certain theories in philosophy or in science, the reason why we accept certain ideas and claims, is because we have good reasons for them, that's where the evidence leads us, that's where the best arguments lead us. So we believe that the reason we accept certain ideas has to do with the proper functioning of our rational faculties and the proper functioning of our sense organs and so on and so forth. If the principle of sufficient reason is false, though, if as a matter of objective fact, things need not have an explanation, there may be no rhyme or reason for why things happen the way they do, that might be true of our rational faculties themselves. And
how does he jump from there's no rhyme or reason that we can't explain everything? He's throwing out the baby with the bathwater here, don't you think? Doesn't it sound like that to you guys? Like, couldn't we say that on some questions that we investigate, we might not ever find an answer, but we still try? And he's moving towards that, well, if you deny that everything needs an explanation, then, well, we can't even trust or say that our cognitive faculties are reliable. Like, this is just so puzzling to me.
Perceptual apparatus itself. It may be that the reasons we believe things have nothing to do with the fact that they are rational or that they are supported by the evidence of our senses. It might be that we believe them for reasons that for which there's no rhyme or reason whatsoever.
Again, remember what I said earlier? Is there a rhyme or reason for why your God's nature is what it is and not something else?
And it only seems to us as if they're well supported by arguments or well supported by the evidence of the senses. So if we're consistent in denying the principle of sufficient reason, they're going to be forced into a position where we'll have no reason to trust our own rational faculties or perceptual apparatus.
And so Arif, by casting doubt on it, effectively undermines the whole process of rationalism, and that's going to be a problem. Quick response, Arif, and then we'll go to a break and we'll have another 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, I want you to, this guy talked, Ed Feser talked for, I think, 4 minutes there. Listen to Arif Ahmed respond. I don't remember exactly. I didn't write it down, but I have a feeling he's just going to very concisely say why this is just baloney.
It's to continue the conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think that claim is just plain false. I think that one can perfectly well trust one's senses and trust scientific inquiry as long as one thinks, for instance, that almost everything has an explanation. That can make one justified in being highly confident in one's senses. And of course, science itself never deals in certainties or gives us 100% knowledge. It only gives us this or that probability. So there's no reason why one shouldn't believe something significantly weaker than the principle of sufficient reason, or at least weaker enough as to undercut the argument for the existence of God that we're looking at, while still thinking that science almost certainly and almost always gets us to the truth, as do our sense organs.
You see that? This is a pattern I see in general between, let's say, theistic philosophers versus both these guys are philosophers versus atheist philosophers. It's like the theist philosophers have more explaining to do. It's like they got to work harder, they got to talk longer, and the atheist can just come and say, no, we can say that, some things we can explain, some things we don't. We can say there's times where our cognitive faculties are reliable and sometimes they're not. You don't have to have these blanket, well, if you deny this, then you have to deny you can even think.
We'll go to that break now and let you respond to that, Ed, in just a moment's time. We're tackling here on Unbelievable 2 philosophical arguments for the existence of God, as outlined in Ed Feser's new book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. This second one, the Rationalist Proof, looking at the idea of whether it's a good book to read, digest, and also to listen to conversations like today on with Arif Ahmed, who is an atheist philosopher at Cambridge University and responds.
Yeah, Bill, it does, what Ed Feser was saying does sound like Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism.
To some of the arguments in Ed's book. So we got to the point, both gentlemen, where we're talking about whether this principle of sufficient reason that Ed has talked about necessitates a necessary being, so that we don't have an endless chain of causes or indeed.
Oh yeah, I remember what's coming up. This is very interesting. I think you'll see a very blatant use of special pleading by Ed Feser coming up.
The contingent existence of things has to have something that stops that infinite regress. So in that last section, Ed, Arif was essentially saying, I can still assume that the majority of the time there are reasons, for things happening in science and so on, without having to assume that there has to be this necessary existence sort of.
This was published December 8th, 2017, my open mind. And so when exactly this debate took place, I'm not sure. But I think it's not too old. It's probably under a year old.
At the very kind of bottom of everything in that sense. Where did you want to go after that?
Yeah, so Arif's argument was that we needn't be committed to the full PSR, the full principle of sufficient reason, in order to make sense of the practice of science. That you could believe that your senses and rational faculties are reliable or reliable enough to get scientific inquiry going and to be able to trust the results of, at least in a tentative way, the results of scientific explanation without believing that absolutely everything has an explanation. Now, the problem I see with that is I think it's ultimately on analysis going to turn out to be question begging. It's going to beg the question against the sort of argument I was giving earlier. Because if we're going to say that our rational faculties and our sensory apparatus, our sense organs and so forth are reliable, and then suppose we say, well,
sometimes they're reliable, sometimes they're not. That's why we develop machines and ways to test to see if our sense perceptions are deceiving us.
The reason we think they're reliable is because we have such and such evidence from common sense, or we have such and such evidence from neuroscience or cognitive psychology or what have you. Well, once again, we're going to be doing the very thing that I described earlier. We're going to be supposing that the evidence that the neuroscientific or cognitive science arguments make reference to is reliable evidence that our sense organs got things right in providing us with the evidential base to develop those theories, or that the reasoning process we used to get from that evidence to our theory was a reliable bit of reasoning. That's going to presuppose the reliability of our cognitive faculties in the very act of trying to argue for the reliability of our cognitive faculties. That's already a kind of circularity, but it also involves exactly the sort of problem I described earlier, is that it assumes that the reason why we believe these things about what cognitive science tells us or neuroscience tells us or what have you has to do with the fact that there's good evidence in its favor, or that the sensory evidence and so forth is reliable. But it might be, if the principle of sufficient reason is false, that the reason why we believe these things has nothing to do with actual evidence or with the operation of our cognitive faculties, and it only seems to, that there's really no intelligibility at all to the way we arrive at our beliefs. So I think that this attempt to sidestep my earlier argument.
I can't help but think when he uses the word intelligibility that he's importing, he doesn't come out and say it, but he's importing this whole concept of a soul and a God in that term, in that word.
That you're led into incoherence if you deny the principle of sufficient reason is ultimately going to be circular, or it's going to miss the point of the argument. As I put it elsewhere, someone who denies the principle of sufficient reason is really committed to the idea that there are brute facts in the world, that there's some things that are just completely unintelligible. but that you can somehow limit this. And I want to say you can't really limit it. That being, it's like being a little pregnant. You can't have just a little bit of bruteness in the world or brute facts in the world. It's either all going to be intelligible or all intelligibility goes out the window.
Oh man, I want to rewind that.
In the world, it's like being a little pregnant. You can't have just a little bit of bruteness in the world or brute facts in the world. It's either all going to be intelligible or all intelligibility goes out the window.
It's either going to be all intelligible or all intelligibility goes out the window. Are you listening to this guy? And when it comes to brute facts, like that, a brute fact, from my understanding, is a core presupposition. So I would say why is Planck's constant and not something else? Why is the nuclear force there and not, as opposed to not? Like the very fundamental nature of our reality, where we can't explore any deeper, that I would say are brute facts. That's just the way it is. Why is it that way? I don't know. Why couldn't it be something else? Maybe it could, but this is what we got. And when I'm hearing Ed Feser say that unless you can explain these things, you can't explain anything, I don't know what to say to this other than it just sounds incredibly stupid. But hopefully Arif can respond better than me.
A quick response, and then perhaps let's move on to another of your objections before time escapes us.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose my response is that I just don't see why those claims should disturb someone. First of all, it's perfectly true that if someone doubted all of my cognitive faculties, including my rational faculty, I wouldn't be able to say anything to convince him otherwise. That kind of radical skeptic is not someone I think you can defeat. But I don't think that anyone should care about that. I don't think that matters, and certainly it doesn't stop us from conducting the activities of everyday life or of science. So I'm not clear. I'm not clear what the argument is for the incoherence. If it's anything other than we couldn't rationally justify from absolutely no principles at all why we ever trust anything or believe anything. Scientific inquiry doesn't proceed in that way. We always take some things for granted.
My open mind, thank you for the donation. Doug, I have to go. We'll watch this later. Really enjoy the series and your why I no longer go to church. Oh, don't tell your pastor that. Have a good day, my open mind.
In order to do other things. The second point is just that Ed again says that if we reject the PSR, then it might be true that these are brute facts that we're encountering. It might be true that we've got no... Of course, it might be true. All kinds of things are consistent. It might be true that trees start talking tomorrow. The question is, do we have any reason to think it's remotely likely? And if we think, for instance, that the PSR is true almost always in our experience, but there's no reason to think it's true everywhere and 100% and at all times, then that seems to me a perfectly consistent position, consistent both with the evidence of the senses, with rationality, and with the conduct of science in everyday life.
I will let you put your second objection now before time runs out, Arif.
Thank you. Well, actually, I had a couple of things to say, so I have to sort of decide which of the things I want to talk about. So I suppose one thing concerns this really is to put it again in the setting of the argument. The general structure of the arguments we've been seeing are ones that involve a kind of regress, and the regress has to stop somewhere, and the thing at which the regress stops has a different feature from all the things that took us down the chain towards it.
Yeah, he's talking about the brute facts or the presuppositions.
In the first place. So one of the issues that I have with this argument concerns the impossibility of an infinite series. And the idea was supposed to be we couldn't have an infinite backward sequence of explanations because then we would never really have explained anything. That argument seems to me to presuppose that in order to explain anything, you also have to explain the explainer. And that statement, I think, is false. I can explain, for instance, the results of the US presidential election last year in terms of facts about the campaign that preceded it, but that's a perfectly good explanation, or it might be, that doesn't itself stop working simply because I haven't also explained the facts, explained the difference between the campaigns that preceded it. So if we drop that principle that to explain something you also have to explain the explainer, then it seems to me that there's no reason at all why we shouldn't have an infinite regress.
There you go. So you don't need to explain why the basic fundamental laws of physics exist, why we have these physical constants. You don't have to explain those in order to explain why water boils at 100 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so what about an infinite regress, says Arif. How do you respond it?
Right. So where the question of infinite regress is concerned, there are two basic kinds of regress we're talking about here. There are causal regresses, and then there are explanatory regresses. So let me just say a little bit about each of those, though they are closely related, I think. So where causation is concerned, you have a distinction traditionally drawn in Aristotelian philosophy and in writers like Aquinas between what I call in the book a hierarchical causal series versus a linear causal series. And the kind of regress that writers like Aquinas and Aristotle are concerned with is...
Okay, Aquinas and Aristotle, we're talking about seeing the world around us, trying to make sense of it, trying to come up with the explanations. Dr. Edward Feser, if you're listening to this, Aristotle and Aquinas were absolute idiots when it comes to scientific knowledge as compared to today. Dr. Edward Feser, my guess is you have a 10-year-old, if you have 6 kids currently. Your 10-year-old knows more about how the world works than Aristotle or Aquinas. Aristotle and Aquinas are absolute ignoramuses. I'm using this strong language just to show you just the perspective of the writings that you're using here to defend this God. These guys knew almost nothing compared to what we know today and can explain today.
The kind that I call a hierarchical kind of causal series, which Aquinas illustrates with the example of a hand which pushes a stick, which in turn pushes a stone. And the idea is that the stick can push the stone, but not under its own steam. It has power to push the stone only insofar as it derives it from the hand, and the hand in turn derives it from me, but I'm not deriving my power to move other things in the same way that the stick is. Nobody has to pick me up in order for me to go ahead and move the stick, the way that the stick needs me to pick it up in order for it to move the stone. So the idea is that in that kind of causal series, the reason why it has to work back to a first member is that the later members in the series have no causal power on their own. They're causally inert. And so they have causal power only insofar as they borrow it from something else. And so you can't have borrowed causal power without something to borrow it from.
You can't have borrowed causal power without have something to borrow it from. Okay, without understanding how a hydrogen atom, what it's composed of, or where it came from, or why negatives and positives attract, I can understand why one electron from a hydrogen atom in its valence shell can jump over to an oxygen, and why another valence electron can jump from another hydrogen and fill 2 shells up for an oxygen and form an H2O water molecule. I can explain how that happens without having to even know why electrons and protons are attracted together in the first place. It has explanatory power, what I just said, on how a water molecule is formed, without going further back. So I just, like Edward Feser is basically saying, no, if you can't explain all of it, then you can't explain any of it. And this is just like, Christians, do you agree with this guy?
And this kind of causal series, the Aristotelian argues, ultimately has to trace to something which has causal power in a built-in or inherent way rather than a derivative way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the causal series in existence at all. That's why we need to get to something that's unlike the other members of the series, where we're talking about causation. So in the Aristotelian proof that I gave earlier at the beginning of our discussion, the idea is that here we have a kind of causation, the actualization of potential, and the reason why you need to get to something that can actualize without itself being actualized is precisely because we have this kind of hierarchical causal series with the...
Okay, I'm going to pound this over and over again and show the special pleading here. Ed Feser, you're talking about you have to explain the foundation, otherwise you can't really explain everything that follows from that foundation. The foundation of your belief, Dr. Feser, is the nature of your deity, the nature of your God. Can you explain why that nature is what it is and why it's not something else? And if you can't, and if you want to be consistent, I don't think you can explain anything about Christianity. It has every step of Christianity, every core proposition is borrowed from something else ahead of it. And if it all ultimately ends at the nature of your God, and if you can't tell me why God is hate instead of love, is there a reason why the nature of your God is love instead of hate? If you can't explain that, why the nature is what it is, you can't explain anything of Christianity, and you might as well just leave Christianity today.
Other members have no causal power unless they derive it from something that has the causal power in a built-in way. And that would have to be in something that can actualize without itself being actualized. So that's one point, and maybe I'll pause here in case we want to pick up that discussion. We can come up to the other kind of series.
Was this the kind of causal sequence that you had in mind in terms of what you don't feel it would have to be terminated at some point in the way that obviously Ed feels it does have to be in order to be able to speak coherently about it?
Well, I took it that the argument we're looking at now involved an explanatory sequence rather than a causal sequence.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But I will say something about this, which is that, again, it seems to me to be false to say that, if A causes B and B causes C, then B doesn't have the power to cause C without A. So if we take, for instance, if I throw a stone at a window and the window smashes and the smashing of the window causes somebody inside to jump, then the smashing sound of the window itself has the power to cause the jumping, whatever caused it, whether it was a stone or something else. So I think the example of the stick is somewhat misleading in that connection. It can certainly be true that A can cause B and B can cause C, and that means that B really does cause C. It's not that it causes it in some second-rate way or in a derivative way. It really does cause C. All we're asking after then is the cause of B. So I don't think that argument works for causation. But in any case, I think this argument is really directed at the explanatory regress rather than the causal regress.
Oh, wow. Like Dr. Edward Feser is in my opinion, bloviating for 4 or 5 minutes in each segment, or maybe 2 to 4 minutes in each little segment. And Arif just boom. Edward is saying, well, you can't explain why a person jumped unless you explain why the window broke. And you can't explain why the window broke unless you can explain why the stick or rock was thrown at the window. And you can't explain why the stick... And Arif's just saying, no, we can explain why someone jumped because they heard the window break. Full stop. Now, you can keep going back on that, but on each individual step, we can say we have sufficient reason to understand why the person jumped.
But maybe similar points will come up for that.
Right. Yeah, so that's fair enough. So real quick, what I would say about the first point Arif made is that the scenario he's describing where the stone is thrown at the window, then the window shatters, and then the noise causes an effect in someone who hears the shattering and so forth, that would be an instance of what I refer to in the book as a linear causal series rather than a hierarchical one. And one difference here is that linear series are typically extended forward and backward in time, whereas hierarchical series have to do with simultaneous causation, here and now and at any particular moment. So while he's right about that example, it's not an example of the specific kind of causation I had in mind in what I said. So that's one point. But he's also right that...
Yeah, I get a feeling what Ed Feser means when he says what he just said is that God is holding every moment of these cause and effects in the palm of his hand, and that without God sustaining this hierarchy of explanation, ultimately the root of it is that God's sustaining all these cause and effects. I think that's what he's saying here.
We're talking about something a little bit different when we talk about the rationalist proof. So what I would say about that, about the issue of explanatory regress, is basically this, or one way to approach it is this, that when we give an explanation in terms of a scientific sort, for example, we're typically appealing, at least in part, to laws of nature. And then we have to ask, well, what explains the laws of nature? Suppose we're explaining something in terms of Kepler's laws of planetary motion. And then the response is, well, we can explain those as a special case of more general laws, like Newtonian mechanics. And then if someone says, yeah, okay, but what about Newtonian mechanics? How do we account for that? And the answer would be, well, that's a special case of a more general theory, Einstein's relativity. And we could take it down to some basic set of laws And then we've reached, at least for the philosophical naturalist, we've reached the bedrock of explanation. But of course, the Aristotelian philosopher or the Thomist is going to say, yeah, but those fundamental laws themselves could have been different, so why aren't they? Or why do we have a law-governed universe at all? We need to.
And you could just say, I don't know. That's just the way it is. And wouldn't you say the exact same thing, Ed Feser, towards the nature, not the existence, but the nature of your deity, of the God you worship and serve? Why is it that and not something else? Is there a reason? Is it just arbitrary that God is love?
To explain those. And then, of course, that's part of the argument that takes us to theism according to the rationalist proof. So in order to get around that, the naturalist is going to have to say, well, when we reach the fundamental laws of physics, say, we simply have to take those as given. We have to take those as a brute fact. But that doesn't rob the higher level laws of their explanatory force. But I would deny that. I would say that, well, look, if the higher level laws are really just special cases of lower level laws, then if you derive the lowest level laws of any intelligibility, you say they're just a brute fact. The fundamental laws of physics are just a brute fact. And the higher level laws are just special cases of them. Well, if the bottom level are just a brute fact and unintelligible, then that really means the higher level laws are unintelligible as well. As I put it in the book, it's kind of like, to say that we can explain things by taking them down to deeper and deeper levels of laws, but when we get to the deepest level, we say that's just a brute fact without any explanation. That's like putting a book on a shelf so that it...
Okay, he's going to make an analogy here. I want you to think, Dr. Edward Feser, I doubt if you'll ever watch this video, but if you do, I want you to imagine your God's nature in this analogy that you're about to say. Your God's nature.
This level, we say that's just a brute fact without any explanation. That's like putting a book on a shelf so that it doesn't fall, putting the shelf on some brackets so that they don't fall, but then hanging the brackets midair where they're just going to collapse. We really rob what originally seemed like an explanation of its explanatory force.
Yeah, so if it's a brute fact that your God's nature is what it is and not something else, then it just falls. It just, like that book in the shelf that's just suspended in air, it just crumbles. You have no foundation if you can't explain why your God's nature is the way it is. No, brute facts, almost by definition, core presuppositions, they are by definition that rock solid foundation from which you build things up. It's not like just this willy-nilly fuzzy thing. And we discover these brute facts through investigation, and we come to a point where we just stop and say, well, we can't go any further, at least not yet. Maybe someday we could go further, and we can push that brute fact a little further. But for a moment in time, we can say this is the best we can do. Now, that doesn't at all take away from all the stuff that we've explained beforehand.
Okay, so funnily enough, this whole talk of brute facts came up in a recent cosmological episode when we were talking about these very ideas about whether you can have a brute fact, and that was Sean Carroll, who's a science popularizer in the USA, said, yes, I do have essentially a brute fact, but it's just...
Jen says, at least William Lane Craig and Plantinga can be understood by a layman. One thing I like about Ed Feser is he doesn't like Alvin Plantinga. He thinks that type of apologetic is no good, I think. I could be wrong about that.
Just, you've got your brute fact in God, so we've both got a brute fact at the end of the day. But for you, presumably, in this case, Ed, God is not the same kind of a brute fact as...
Okay, this is what I've been pounding Ed Feser since we started this. And so, I forget this guy's name, the guy who runs Unbelievable Podcast. But he's asking the question now that I've been asking for a long time.
Presumably, in this case, Ed, God is not the same kind of a brute fact as the naturalist who says, the fundamental laws of the universe are a brute fact. Because, what do you want to tell us quickly before Arif responds?
Yeah. I would say God is not a brute fact. And the reason he's not is that God's existence is explained by his own nature.
Substitute God's existence. He said God's existence is explained by his nature, but what explains his nature? It boggles my mind. Okay, he might explain it here coming up, but it boggles my mind that a PhD in philosophy cannot take that one step further.
You could say self-explanatory in that way. He's not self-caused. Causation's a different notion here. But he is self-explanatory in the sense that it's the very nature of God spelled out by the Aristotelian in terms of the idea of his being pure actuality with no potentiality. Or in the case of Thomas Aquinas, say, he would...
Pure actuality. Well, why can't we just say Planck's constant is pure actuality without potentiality? It's whatever answer you give for your God's nature, why can't we apply that to certain core presuppositions within the naturalist worldview?
Say, God's very essence just is subsistent existence and so forth. Of course, that requires some unpacking. But the idea is that the divine nature itself explains the existence of God. So we don't have a violation of PS.
He explains himself. The divine nature of God explains himself. But what explains the divine nature?
Are here. We just have a different kind of explanation than we have in the world of contingent things.
Okay.
It's just a different kind of explanation. Like that is the definition of special pleading right there.
We just have a different kind of explanation than we have in the world of contingent things.
Okay. Do you want to talk about brute facts at this point, Arif, or where do you want to take your response here? And we've just got a few minutes left, so we will start wrapping things up now.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, there's a couple of things I guess I want to say about that. The first thing is that if we grant what I think you're saying, which is that if any chain of explanations just bottoms out in brute facts, then at no point then none of the points in the chain were explanations in the first place. I mean, if that's what we're going to say, then the argument looks kind of question-begging because one of the reasons for believing the principle of sufficient reason in the first place was that we do find that things have explanations in everyday life and in science. But of course, if by explanation you mean big explanation that doesn't bottom out in brute facts, there's no evidence that isn't question-begging that we ever find those things in science or everyday life. So then I would start to question the premise that we have prima facie evidence for the PSR. And then the other point was that the sort of objection I was getting at...
I want to try to rephrase what he just said, because I think Arif Ahmed nailed it there. The whole idea of what they call PSR, which is the principle of sufficient reason, that things need to have reasons for their existence or for why things happen the way they happen. And Ed Feser is saying, well, look, if you look around the world, our intuitions, our day-to-day experiences, they cry out for explanation, and we look for explanation. We see that if I pick up a ball and move my arm in this motion and let go, it travels, and we need to explain it. And Arif is saying, hey, look, if you're saying that we can't really explain how a ball is thrown without going all the way back to the beginning, if there's no reason for that beginning, we can't explain any of it, then the whole foundation that the principle of sufficient reason just collapses. It's because it starts from these simple, isolated need for explanations. I think maybe I just made things worse by explaining it.
That wasn't really an attempt to defend that view, though I think it is perfectly defensible, but rather an attempt to ask what the contradiction is in this claim that everything is explained by something else. That claim, which is presumably can allow for an infinite chain of explanations, isn't obviously inconsistent unless there's some notion of explanation you have in mind, whether it be causal or deductive, nomological, or some other kind of statistical or some other sort of explanation from which you can derive a contradiction. So I guess those are the two things I'd want to bring up at this point.
Well, we are more or less out of time. I'll give you a quick chance to respond, Ed, and we'll have to leave it there and maybe continue it in the pub, metaphorically speaking, later on. But yes, how do you want to finish things up here, Ed?
Well, I guess just very briefly then I would say that I'm not sure that I see the ground for the charge of circular reasoning or question begging on the part of the defender of PSR here. The way I put it a few moments ago was that if we're going to take higher level laws like Kepler's laws, say, or Newtonian mechanics, the laws of Newtonian mechanics, as special cases or as approximations of deeper level laws, if that's really what they are, then if the deepest level laws are simply unintelligible, and the other laws are just special cases or approximations of them, then it's hard to see how those higher level laws can be fail to be unintelligible as well.
It's hard to see. Have you tried, Ed Feser? Have you tried to see it? It goes back to the window breaking and the person jumping example. We can explain why those things happen. You don't have to say that if you can't explain the beginning, you can't explain any of it. I'm sure there's a fallacy name given for that, but it eludes me right now.
In which case, they're not really what we initially thought they were when we were appealing to them as an explanation. It's a kind of bait and switch, I think, that's implicitly going on, unintentionally, of course, but that's going on when the naturalist ultimately wants to introduce bruteness or failure of explanation at the bottom level. I'm not sure what's question-begging about that, whether or not one wants to reject it for some other reason.
We do.
Well, I would say you have no justification to explain. You don't have sufficient reason, Dr. Edward Feser, to explain why the nature of your God is what it is and not something else. It's purely arbitrary, is it not? And whatever answer you give to this schmuck called PineCreek, I'll just use that same answer for the universe, capital U, which includes what might have existed before the singularity.
Do have to call it a day there. I apologise because I'd love to have continued it for longer, but time has beaten us. All I can say is you guys just have the most razor-sharp minds, and I mean that because
He's half right.
You've carried this on for over an hour now, and both of you have just been absolutely on top of it, and so I take my hat off, my thinking cap off to both of you. But thank you very much for coming in and spending some time with us, Arif.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ed, for being on the line. More details about both my guests from today's...
Okay, so that's the clip. I think I want to play Sean Carroll's take on all this. And I think Sean Carroll is like the physicist version of Arif Ahmed. And here, Sean Carroll's a guy he's a PhD in theoretical physics. And he tackles this problem. It's first cause, cosmological argument, contingency argument. They're all related. Let's see if I can find it. I think this is it.
So, what does it mean, and what is the role played by God as an unmoved mover, as an Aristotelian first cause, God as a necessary being? Very often, if you ask theologians, how would the universe be different if God did not exist? They will say, I cannot imagine a universe in which God does not exist, therefore I cannot answer that question. To me, as a scientist, there's a huge problem right from the start with this kind of reasoning, which is that it is the whole strategy is one based on some a priori metaphysics. That is to say, this is, very much armchair philosophizing in the best sense of the word, sitting down, thinking about.
So Sean Carroll is basically speaking directly to guys like Dr. Edward Feser right now.
All the possible ways the world can be, and concluding that those ways must somehow involve the idea of God. There's no step in that process in which you actually go out and look at how the universe actually is. You don't need to in this way of thinking about it, because you can just argue logically that God must be part of the universe. It is my firm belief that this kind of reasoning has never taught us anything true and interesting about the actual world. That is not to say that armchair thinking without going out and looking at the world is not useful in any way. It's extremely useful. Mathematics, logic, other branches of philosophy and formal inquiry are not empirical in nature. They don't involve going out and looking at the actual world. They reason in an a priori sense, but they also don't reveal interesting truths about the actual world.
Okay, let me summarize what Sean Carroll has just said. He said that he's saying that Ed Feser's work is a waste of time when it comes to actually understanding the world around us.
Mathematics reveals consequences of axioms. You say, I have a certain axiomatic structure and I derive theorems on the basis of that. It doesn't tell you which axioms are possibly true. If you want to actually figure out our universe, does it involve some notion of God, that is an actual fact about the specific universe in which we live. And I personally don't think that this a priori kind of reasoning is ever going to get us there. But let me take it seriously for just a little bit and sort of give you my feelings as a scientist about this. How would we refute the claim that God is a necessary being, for example? And I should also admit that I'm happily conflating all sorts of ultimately different kinds of...
Okay, now remember we just listened to Dr. Edward Feser poo-pooing brute facts. Dr. Edward Feser, how can we refute the claim that God is a necessary being? Well, you can't refute that. It's just entailed in his nature. It's a brute fact, maybe?
Happily conflating all sorts of ultimately different kinds of a priori metaphysical arguments, first cause, prime mover, necessary being. These are all subtly different in ways that I'm going to completely ignore, so sorry about that. They have a similar flavor, and I'm going to treat them similarly. So if you did believe that God was a necessary being, that you literally could not imagine a universe in which God did not play an important role, in order, logically, for me to refute that belief, all I need to do is to invent a universe in which God does not exist. You know, if you say that all swans are white, as a logical fact, all I need to do is show you one black swan to show that your logical argument can't be right.
Okay, so I would think if anybody can do what Sean Carroll is requesting, to imagine a universe that doesn't require a necessary being, if anybody can do that, it would be a philosopher. But let me caveat that. It would be a good philosopher. So let's imagine, and I think Sean Carroll talks about a universe that just consists of a single point, a dot. Does that require a necessary being? Nothing moves in it, in this universe. It's just a dot. Can you imagine that universe, Dr. Edward Feser? If you can't, just try. Just try. There's no necessary being required for that universe. So the point Sean Carroll's making here is that one way, if you're going to be a good philosopher, is use your imagination skills, come up with ways to refute this concept of a necessary being, and then see if there's ways to identify cases where we would need a necessary being versus a case where we wouldn't. And to look at the evidence, the universe that we see, and see, does our universe actually require a necessary being? Speaking of universes, I want to skip to the end here, and because this is, I think, a point that Sean Carroll makes that eludes a lot of theists. Let's see if I can find it.
Better job, at the very least, a theory of quantum gravity before we can actually draw conclusions about what happened at that moment. Right now, it's better to simply say we don't know. We can, of course, say, can we possibly know? Is it possible to imagine theories of the universe in which the beginning of the universe is explained? Or do we need to hold that idea separate, giving it an opportunity for God to sneak in there and play a role? So I don't know what the right theory of the origin of the universe is, but I have no shortage of plausible theories. So
notice, kid, this is a huge difference between what I think is an intellectually honest thinker and one that's not. Sean Carroll just says, I can think of many theories of the beginnings of the universe, but I wonder if Edward Feser can.
Well, let me just give you some of them. One is that the Big Bang really is the beginning, that the universe was in some sense created from nothing. Stephen Hawking, obviously, very famously has promoted this idea for a long time. But it's not the only one on the market. There is the cyclic universe, a universe which the Big Bang is just a phase that the universe goes through, that it expands and collapses again and bounces an infinite number of times. There is eternal inflation. Joe already talked about inflationary cosmology, the idea that from a very tiny patch of space, a negative pressure fluid can force the universe to accelerate a huge amount and grow greatly in volume. Well, it turns out that that can happen forever. And you can go from one little universe to many, many little sub-universes, and that can, again, happen an infinite number of times. There's also my favorite idea, which is that this kind of thing happens, but it happens in both directions of time. So that there's some point in the universe which is sort of a middle, and to the right and to the left of that, the universe grows and gets bigger and creates many little offspring universes.
Okay, so Sean Carroll's giving the top one's gone, but at least 4 different ways that our universe, small u, starting with the Big Bang, could have come into being. And so I would ask a guy like Ed Feser, how did you rule these out? How did you rule them out? How did you come to the decision that it is your God? And you could expand all these options. You could say that maybe a deity of some sort did create the universe, but used materials that pre-existed our universe to make it. In other words, that a God created our universe not out of nothing, but out of something. How did you rule that one out? How did you rule out the possibility that two gods did it, each with their own expertise on the universe? Maybe one specialized on black holes or dark matter, and one specialized in atoms and nuclear fusion and so forth. How did you take that off the table? It's like, at some point, don't you just have to admit, be humble enough to say, we don't know? And maybe consider the possibility that because either of a psychological need for explanation and how we were raised, that we just want something to believe something is true. And I understand that theists can say that, well, you just want there to be no God so you can stay in your sin and stuff like that. But as truth seekers, I don't think we can just willy-nilly throw these other options off the table, no matter how uncomfortable it may seem. Cue the music. Yeah, Troy, I think you're right. Feser ruled them out because of theology. So, I hope this helps. If you're a Christian who got this far, I don't care if you leave Christianity or not. But I want you to be able to at least understand why guys like me don't find these arguments convincing, compelling. Why guys like me can see special pleading. I don't know, Iron Charioteer, if it's the fact that theists are lazy, or if it just seems better to them. Because I honestly believe that what we talked about today is extremely important, and this is a major reason why a lot of theists are theists. A lot of times when I ask the question, why do you believe? First cause is a big one. It's huge. Okay, guys, have a wonderful day. May science bless you. Take care.